In Chicago's Lincoln Park, a 10-year-old fundraiser named Luis Mendoza was about to experience the harshest side of urban life. His innocent cookie stand meant to help his sick sister turned deadly when local gang enforcer Big Tone demanded protection money and escalated to violence. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical afternoon stroller. For decades, he had been a martial arts icon and former law enforcement officer, known for dismantling entire criminal operations with nothing but precision and principle. When Big Tone slapped the child's earnings into the dirt and shoved his mother aside, he had no idea he was challenging a man who had toppled drug cartels and trained elite operatives. Seagal responded with silent authority and surgical movement that would trigger a ripple of resistance and redemption across the community. What began as a child's charity cookie sale became a public reckoning. Lincoln Park would never be the same after the moment a bully struck a child and Steven Seagal stepped in. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Saturday sun painted Chicago's Lincoln Park with golden warmth, casting dancing shadows through the old oak trees that had watched over this neighborhood for decades. The weekend market buzzed with life, a beautiful tapestry of cultures woven together in the heart of the city. Korean vendors called out prices for fresh produce. Elderly Irishmen played cards at weathered picnic tables, and the sweet aroma of Arab coffee mixed with the scent of Mexican churros from competing food carts. 10-year-old Luis Mendoza carefully arranged his small folding table beside Mr. Hakim's fruit stand, his tongue poking out in concentration as he positioned each chocolate chip cookie in perfect rows. The table wobbled slightly on the uneven pavement, but Luis steadied it with the practiced patience of a child who'd learned to make the best of imperfect situations. "Mijo, are you sure about this?" Marisol Mendoza called softly from her own small table 20 feet away, where she sold cleaning supplies and homemade soaps. Her voice carried the musical accent of Guadalajara, tinged with the worry that had become her constant companion since Rosa's diagnosis. She pretended to organize her bottles of pine cleaner, but her dark eyes rarely left her son. Luis looked up, his gap-toothed grin bright enough to outshine the afternoon sun. "See, Mama, I practiced my speech 100 times. Listen," he cleared his throat dramatically and straightened his shoulders. "Fresh cookies for Rosa's recovery fund. Only $2 each, baked with love and hope." Mr. Hakim's deep laughter rumbled from the neighboring fruit stand. The elderly Nigerian man had been watching Luis's preparations with the bemused affection of a grandfather. "Luis, my boy, you might just put me out of business with that sales pitch. Who needs mangoes when you've got cookies baked with hope?" "Your mangoes smell better, though, Mr. Hakim," Luis replied diplomatically, then whispered conspiratorially, "But don't tell my cookies I said that." The old man's eyes crinkled with delight. "Your secret is safe with me, young entrepreneur. But tell me again, what makes these cookies so special?" Luis's chest puffed with pride. "It's Abuela's recipe. She taught me before she went to heaven. She said the secret ingredient is stirring clockwise while you think happy thoughts about the people you love." His voice dropped to a reverent whisper. I stirred for Rosa the whole time. From her table, Marisol felt her throat tighten. Luis had spent 3 evenings this week baking batch after batch, burning his first attempt and crying frustrated tears into the second. But he'd persisted, determined to master his grandmother's recipe. The kitchen had smelled like heaven, and watching her son's determined face covered in flour had made her heart ache with pride and worry in equal measure. Rosa," Luis murmured to himself, carefully adjusting a hand-drawn sign that read, "Help Rosa run and play again," in crayon letters. "Wait until you see how much money we make today. You'll be running faster than anybody." 8-year-old Rosa was at home, curled up in their small apartment with coloring books and dreams of playground adventures. Her rare blood condition had stolen her energy for months, leaving her pale and fragile while other children ran and laughed outside their window. The medical bills had piled up like autumn leaves, each one a reminder of how little their family had and how much they needed. "First customer," Luis announced excitedly as a young professional woman approached, her phone pressed to her ear. She smiled at his enthusiasm, pausing her conversation to point at 2 cookies. "For Rosa?" she asked, reading his sign. "Yes, ma'am. My little sister. She's gonna be so happy when she can run again. Luis carefully wrapped the cookies in tissue paper, his small hands working with the precision of someone who'd practiced this routine dozens of times. The woman handed him a $5 bill. Keep the change, sweetheart. Tell Rosa I hope she feels better soon. Luis's face lit up like Christmas morning. Really? Thank you. Rosa's gonna love hearing that. He waved enthusiastically as she walked away, then turned to his cash box. With reverent care, smoothing the $5 bill before placing it inside. One sale down, maybe 50 to go, he whispered, consulting a small notebook where he'd calculated how much he needed to raise. His math teacher had helped him figure out that if he sold cookies every weekend for 2 months, he might raise enough to help with Rose's next round of treatments. The afternoon crowd began to thicken. A construction worker with paint-splattered overalls bought 3 cookies, telling Luis his own daughter was about Rose's age. A group of teenagers pooled their money for a half dozen, one of them ruffling Luis's hair and calling him little businessman. An elderly couple bought 4 cookies and insisted on hearing all about Rose's condition, nodding sympathetically and promising to spread the word. You're doing good, Mijo, Marisol called, her voice warm with pride. She'd been watching the steady stream of customers with growing amazement. In just 2 hours, Luis had made more than she sometimes earned in a full day of selling cleaning supplies. Mr. Hakim leaned over from his fruit stand, lowering his voice. Your boy has something special, Marisol. Look how he talks to each customer like their family. That's not something you can teach. She nodded, blinking back tears. He gets it from his father. Roberto always said you treat everyone like they matter because they do. The mention of her late husband hung in the air for a moment, a bittersweet reminder of the man who'd taught Luis to shake hands firmly and look people in the eye. Roberto had been gone 3 years now, but his lessons lived on in his son's earnest determination. Luis counted his earnings during a brief lull, his lips moving silently as he calculated. $34, he announced proudly. Mr. Hakim, I think I might actually do this. Of course you will, my boy. But remember what I told you about counting money so openly. Keep it tucked away, eh? Luis nodded seriously, closing his cash box with a decisive click. He'd learned to be careful with money from watching his mother stretch every dollar, making decisions between groceries and medicine that no parent should have to make. The park around them pulsed with weekend energy. Children played on the nearby swings while their parents chatted on benches. Street musicians filled the air with competing melodies, and the diverse vendors created a miniature United Nations of commerce and friendship. Luis stood behind his table, shoulders squared with purpose, watching the crowd with the keen eyes of a businessman. He was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he needed to do. Rosa was counting on him, and he would not let her down. In the distance, a car stereo thumped with bass that seemed to shake the very leaves on the trees. The sound grew closer, and some of the vendors glanced nervously in its direction. But Luis was too focused on his mission to notice the subtle shift in the air, the way conversations quieted and smiles became more forced. Change was coming to the park, and it wouldn't be the kind that ended up in Luis's cash box. The music hit the park like a thunderclap, bass notes so deep they seemed to rattle the windows of nearby apartments. Conversations faltered as heads turned toward the source, a black Escalade with tinted windows that pulled up to the curb with the arrogance of someone who owned the street. Luis looked up from arranging his remaining cookies, curious about the commotion. The music cut off abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and wrong. Even the street musicians seemed to pause their performances, as if the very air had become too thick to carry their melodies. 3 men emerged from the vehicle with the casual swagger of wolves who'd found their hunting ground. The first 2 were unremarkable, thin, nervous types who kept their hands in their pockets and their eyes constantly scanning. But the third man commanded attention simply by existing. Big Tone stepped onto the sidewalk like he was stepping onto a stage. At 6'3" and built like a linebacker who'd traded his playbook for a life of intimidation, he had the presence of someone who'd never learned to enter a room quietly. His sleeveless leather vest revealed arms covered in tattoos that told stories of violence and loyalty to causes that existed only in the shadows. A thick gold chain caught the afternoon sunlight, and his dark eyes surveyed the market with the calculating gaze of a predator evaluating his territory. Antonio Ruiz. Mr. Hakim whispered under his breath, using Big Tone's real name like a prayer against evil. Allah protect us all. The elderly fruit vendor had seen enough years to recognize trouble in all its forms, and Big Tone represented the worst kind, the kind that wore success like a mask over deep, dangerous insecurities. Hakim began casually rearranging his mangoes, a nervous habit that helped him think. Marisol felt her stomach clench as she recognized the approaching figure. Every vendor in the neighborhood knew Big Tone by reputation, if not by sight. He was the tax collector for territories that belonged to no government, the enforcer of rules that existed only in the gray spaces between law and chaos. Luis, she called softly, her voice carrying a tremor she couldn't quite suppress. Maybe we should. Fresh cookies, Luis announced cheerfully, oblivious to the tension rippling through the crowd. He'd spotted the new arrivals and assumed they were potential customers. $2 each, and every penny goes to help my sister. Big Tone's attention shifted like a spotlight, finding its target. His eyes locked onto the small boy behind the cookie table, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. In his world, children learned early to recognize authority and defer to it. This one seemed to need an education. Well, Big Tone murmured to his companions, his voice carrying the false warmth of someone who'd learned to make threats sound like conversations. Looks like we got ourselves a new business owner in the neighborhood. He began walking toward Luis's table with deliberate slowness, his heavy boots marking time against the pavement. Other vendors watched from their peripheral vision, afraid to stare directly but unable to look away entirely. This was how it always started, with Big Tone taking an interest in someone who hadn't yet learned the rules of his game. Mrs. Chun from the Korean grocery stand suddenly became very interested in organizing her display of pears. The Arab boys running the coffee cart found urgent business in the opposite direction. Even the card-playing Irish retirees gathered their chips and moved their game to a more distant table. But Luis remained focused on his mission, watching the approaching strangers with the hopeful expression of a child who still believed the world was full of people who wanted to help. "Mama," he whispered excitedly, "I think those men want to buy cookies." Marisol's hands trembled as she pretended to organize her cleaning supplies, her maternal instincts screaming warnings that her son was too young to understand. She'd heard the stories about Big Tone, whispered in break rooms, and shared over coffee between women who worked multiple jobs to keep their families safe. He was the neighborhood's open secret, the price of doing business in a place where legitimate protection was too expensive for people like them. Mr. Hakim cleared his throat, attempting to catch Big Tone's attention. "Afternoon, Mr. Ruiz. Beautiful day for the market, no? Perhaps you'd like to try some fresh mango? Just came in this morning, sweet as honey." Big Tone's smile was the kind that never reached his eyes. "Hakim, my old friend. Always trying to sweeten the day, aren't you?" He paused at the fruit stand, his presence casting a shadow over the colorful display. "But today I'm interested in something different. Something new." His gaze drifted back to Luis, who was now standing straighter, behind his table, practicing his sales pitch under his breath. The boy's innocence was almost offensive to Big Tone, a reminder of a world where people believed in fairness and hard work, concepts that had been beaten out of him years ago. "You know how it is, Hakim," Big Tone continued, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow sounded more menacing than any shout. "New businesses need proper introduction to the neighborhood, need to understand how things work around here." "He's just a boy, Mr. Ruiz," Hakim said carefully, his accent thickening with stress. "Selling cookies for his sick sister. Surely, there's no harm in, no harm." Big Tone's laugh was like broken glass. "Old man, you've been in this neighborhood long enough to know that everything has its place. Everyone has their role, and everybody pays their share." He pulled out his phone, glancing at a text message that made his expression soften for just a moment. A message from the nursing home where his mother lived, reminding him about her medication schedule. For a split second, the mask slipped, revealing something almost human underneath. Then he looked up at Luis's table, and the mask snapped back into place. "Besides," Big Tone said, sliding his phone back into his pocket, "kids got to learn how the world works sometime. Might as well be today." Luis had been watching this exchange with growing confusion, his young mind struggling to understand the undercurrents of tension flowing around him. But he was his father's son, raised to be polite to adults and to always try to help. "Excuse me, sir," Luis called out, his voice carrying the cheerful confidence of a child who'd been having a successful day. "Would you and your friends like to try some cookies? They're made from my grandmother's recipe, and they're really good." Big Tone's smile widened, but it was the kind of smile that made mothers pull their children closer. "Well now, kid, looks like you and I need to have ourselves a little talk." He began walking toward Luis's table, his companions flanking him like an honor guard. The market seemed to hold its breath, vendors finding sudden reasons to look elsewhere, while secretly praying for the small boy who had no idea what was coming. Mr. Hakim muttered a quick prayer in Arabic, his weathered hands gripping a mango so tightly his knuckles went white. Marisol took a step toward her son, then forced herself to stop, knowing that drawing attention to herself might only make things worse. And Luis, sweet Luis, simply smiled and prepared to make his biggest sale of the day, completely unaware that his childhood was about to collide with the harsh realities of a world that had no patience for innocence. Big Tone approached Luis's table with the casual confidence of a man who'd never been told no by anyone he couldn't intimidate. His heavy boots scraped against the pavement, each step deliberate and measured, like a countdown to an explosion that only he could see coming. "Well, hello there, little man," Big Tone said, his voice carrying the false warmth of a predator pretending to be friendly. He leaned against the edge of Luis's table, causing it to wobble slightly. "What's your name, kid?" Luis straightened his shoulders, remembering his father's lessons about making a good impression. "Luis Mendoza, sir. Would you like to buy some cookies? They're fresh baked this morning, and every dollar goes to help my sister Rosa get better." "Rosa, huh?" Big Tone's eyes scanned the handmade sign, his expression a mixture of amusement and something darker. "That's real sweet, Luis. Real sweet indeed. Tell me about this sister of yours." The boy's face lit up with the pure joy of a child talking about someone he loved. "She's 8, and she's the best sister in the world. But she's been sick, and the doctors say she needs special medicine and treatments. They cost lots of money, more than Mama can make, so I'm helping." Big Tone nodded slowly, as if genuinely interested in the story. "That's real noble of you, kid. Real noble. Shows you understand family responsibility." He picked up one of the cookies, examining it with exaggerated care. "These look professional. Your mama help you make them?" "My grandma taught me the recipe before she went to heaven," Luis said proudly. "The secret is stirring clockwise while thinking happy thoughts about the people you love. I stirred for Rosa the whole time." "Clockwise, huh?" Big Tone took a bite of the cookie, chewing slowly. "Not bad. Not bad at all. You got talent, kid. Real entrepreneurial spirit." He swallowed and leaned closer. "But you know what? Running a business in this neighborhood, that's a serious thing. Lots of responsibility. Lots of considerations." Luis tilted his head, genuinely confused. "What kind of considerations, sir?" Big Tone's smile grew wider and colder. "Well, see this park here? This is a special place. Protected place. And protection, well, that costs money. Everyone who does business here, they understand that. They pay their share to keep things safe and peaceful." "Protected from what?" Luis asked, his innocence so genuine it was almost painful to witness. "From bad things, kid. From people who might want to mess with a nice setup like this." Big Tone gestured broadly at the market around them. "See, there's wolves out there. Dangerous folks who might want to knock over a cookie stand, steal a little boy's hard-earned money. That's where I come in." He straightened up, his bulk casting a shadow over Luis's table. "I'm like insurance. I make sure nothing bad happens to the good people trying to make an honest living. All it costs is a small fee. Very reasonable. Very fair." Luis's brow furrowed as he processed this information. "But sir, I don't understand. The police protect people. That's their job, and they don't charge money for it." Big Tone's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Police? Kid, you got a lot to learn about how the world really works. Police got their own problems. They can't be everywhere at once. But me? I'm here. I'm watching. I'm making sure nothing bad happens to little boys selling cookies for their sick sisters." From 20 feet away, Marisol watched this exchange with growing horror. She could see the trap closing around her son, could recognize the predatory patience in Big Tone's posture. Her hands clenched into fists, every maternal instinct screaming at her to intervene. but she knew that drawing attention to herself might only make things worse. Mr. Hakim had abandoned all pretense of organizing his fruit, his ancient eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. He'd seen this dance before, this careful choreography of intimidation and implied violence, but never with someone so young, so innocent. So here's how it works, Luis. Big Tone continued, his voice dropping to a confidential whisper. You made what? About $40 today? That's good money for a kid. Real good. All you gotta do is give me 30%, and I guarantee nothing bad happens to you, or your mama, or your little sister. Fair deal, right? Luis's eyes widened as the implications sank in. But sir, that's Rosa's money. She needs it for her medicine. And she'll get it, Big Tone said smoothly. Just, not all of it. See, this is a business lesson, kid. In business, you got overhead. You got expenses. 30% is a bargain for the kind of protection I provide. But that's not fair. Luis's voice cracked slightly, the injustice of it hitting him like a physical blow. I worked hard for this money. I baked cookies all week. Rosa is counting on me. Big Tone's expression hardened, the mask of false friendliness beginning to slip. Fair? Kid, let me tell you something about fair. Fair is what happens when everyone follows the rules. And the rules in this neighborhood are simple. Everybody pays their share. He leaned down, bringing his face level with Luis's. You seem like a smart boy. Smart enough to understand that some rules are more important than others. More immediate, you might say. Luis looked around desperately, seeking support from the adults who'd been so friendly and encouraging just minutes before. But the market had gone quiet, vendors suddenly finding urgent business elsewhere. Even the children had been called away by nervous parents who recognized the signs of approaching trouble. Mr. Hakim? Luis called out, his voice small and scared. Can you help me understand? This man says I have to pay him money, but I don't understand why. The elderly fruit vendor's face crumpled with shame and helplessness. Luis, my boy. He began, then stopped, unable to find words that could explain a world where children were expected to pay tribute to men who offered protection from dangers they themselves represented. Big Tone straightened up, his patience clearly wearing thin. Hakim ain't gonna help you, kid. Nobody is. This is between you and me, and I'm being more than generous with my time here. He pulled out his phone, making a show of checking the time. Tell you what, Luis. I'm gonna give you exactly 1 minute to make the smart choice here. 1 minute to decide whether you want to be part of this community or whether you want to find out what happens to people who don't follow the rules. Luis's hands trembled as he looked down at his cash box, then back at Big Tone's intimidating presence. But sir, Rosa needs this money. She's been sick for so long, and the doctors said, kid, Big Tone interrupted, his voice going cold. You got about 30 seconds left to make this decision. And let me be clear about something. I don't like repeating myself. And I really don't like people who make me wait. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was about to spread. Luis clutched his cash box tighter, his young mind racing through options he was too young to understand. This wasn't how the world was supposed to work. This wasn't what his father had taught him about right and wrong. I won't give you Rosa's money, Luis said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the unshakable conviction of a child who knew the difference between right and wrong. It's not right. It's not fair. And Rosa needs it more than you do. Big Tone's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, then disbelief, then something much darker. Kid, he said slowly, I don't think you understand what just happened here. I don't think you understand what you just did. He looked around the market, noting the careful way everyone was avoiding eye contact, the systematic way vendors were pretending not to notice the confrontation unfolding at the cookie stand. See all these people? They understand how things work. They know what happens when someone decides they're too good to follow the rules. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Luis's chin trembled, but he didn't back down. My father taught me that there are some things you don't compromise on. Taking care of family is one of them. Your father, huh? Big Tone's smile was cruel now, all pretense of friendliness. Abandoned. Well, kid, your father ain't here. And that's a problem. Because if he was, he'd be smart enough to teach you that some lessons are more important than others. He reached toward Luis's cash box with casual confidence, expecting the boy to flinch away. Instead, Luis pulled it closer to his chest, protecting it like a treasure. "That's Rosa's money," Luis repeated, his voice stronger now. "And you can't have it." Big Tone's patience finally snapped. "Kid, you just made the biggest mistake of your short life." The moment stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Big Tone's hand hovered over Luis's cash box, his face a mask of controlled fury. The boy's defiance had triggered something primal in the enforcer, a rage that came from having his authority questioned by someone who should have been cowering in fear. "Last chance, kid," Big Tone said, his voice dropping to a growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Hand over the money, or I take it anyway. And trust me, you don't want me to have to take it." Luis's small hands tightened around his cash box, knuckles white with determination. "No, sir. This is for Rosa. She needs her medicine." The word "no" hung in the air like a blasphemy. In Big Tone's world, children didn't say no to men like him. Hell, grown men didn't say no to him. This kid was about to learn a lesson that would stay with him for the rest of his life. "Wrong answer," Big Tone snarled. With a casual swipe of his massive hand, he knocked the cash box from Luis's grip. The metal container hit the pavement with a crash that seemed to echo off every building in the park. Bills and coins scattered across the walkway like autumn leaves in a storm, Rosa's future rolling away in all directions. "No," Luis cried out, dropping to his knees immediately, scrambling to gather the scattered money. "Rosa's money. You can't." His small hands moved frantically, trying to collect the bills before they blew away in the afternoon breeze. Tears streamed down his face as he watched months of planning and days of hard work literally scattered to the wind. "Mijo." Marisol's voice cracked like a whip across the market. She'd been watching in paralyzed horror, but seeing her son on his knees, crying over scattered money, shattered her restraint. She started running toward the cookie stand, her maternal instincts overriding every survival instinct she possessed. Big Tone turned toward her approach, his expression shifting from cruel satisfaction to mild annoyance. "Lady, you need to step back. This is between me and the kid. He's 10 years old." Marisol screamed, her voice carrying the fury of a mother defending her child. "He's selling cookies for his sick sister. What kind of monster are you?" "The kind that keeps this neighborhood running smooth," Big Tone replied, stepping directly into her path. "The kind that makes sure everyone knows their place." Luis continued gathering money from the ground, his small hands shaking as he tried to smooth out crumpled bills. "It's okay, Mama," he whispered, though his voice was thick with tears. "I can fix this. I can get Rosa's money back." But Big Tone wasn't finished with his lesson. He looked down at the boy's cookie display, at the neat rows of homemade treats that represented hours of careful work and hopeful dreams. With deliberate malice, he swept his arm across the table, sending cookies flying in all directions. The sound of his grandmother's cookies splattering against the pavement broke something inside Luis. These weren't just cookies. They were love made tangible, memories of flower-dusted afternoons and whispered family recipes. They were his connection to a grandmother who'd believed in him, who'd taught him that hard work and love could overcome any obstacle. "You didn't have to do that," Luis said, his voice barely audible. "Those were for Rosa. They were special. Kid needs to learn." Big Tone said to no one in particular. "Sometimes the only way to teach respect is through disappointment." Marisol tried to push past him to reach her son, but Big Tone casually placed his hand on her shoulder. Not quite a shove, but enough pressure to make his point clear. "I told you to step back, lady. Don't make me tell you again." The market had gone completely silent. Even the distant traffic noise seemed muted, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. Vendors stood frozen behind their stalls, torn between outrage and terror. Children peeked out from behind their parents' legs, sensing something terrible was happening but not understanding what. Mr. Hakim took a tentative step forward, his weathered hands trembling. "Mr. Ruiz, please. He's just a child. Surely we can." "Hakim," Big Tone said without taking his eyes off Luis. "You've been in this neighborhood long enough to know better than to stick your nose where it don't belong." Kid made his choice. Now he lives with it. Luis had managed to collect most of the scattered money, though several bills had blown away entirely. He clutched the crumpled cash to his chest like a shield, his tears mixing with the dirt on his cheeks. "I still won't give you Rosa's money," he whispered, his voice breaking but his resolve intact. "Even if you break everything, even if you hurt me, Rosa needs this more than you do." Big Tone's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, then something that might have been respect, then anger that anyone, especially a child, would dare to make him look weak in front of an audience. "Kid, you got heart," he said, his voice carrying a grudging admiration. "Stupid heart, but heart nonetheless. Too bad heart don't pay the bills." He began advancing on Luis again, his intent clear. The boy scrambled backward, still clutching his money, until he bumped against the base of an old oak tree. There was nowhere left to run. "Please," Luis said, his voice small but still defiant. "Rosa is only 8. She just wants to run and play like other kids. This money could help her do that. And it might still help her," Big Tone said, his voice almost gentle now. "After I take my cut. After everyone understands how things work around here." He reached down toward Luis one more time, confident that the boy had finally learned his lesson. But as his hand moved toward the crumpled bills, a quiet voice cut through the tension like a blade. "That's enough." Big Tone froze, his hand inches from Luis's money. The voice had come from behind him, calm and measured, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be shouted to be heard. "What did you say?" Big Tone turned slowly, his face already shifting into the expression he wore when someone was about to learn a very hard lesson. Standing behind him was a man in faded jeans and a simple gray t-shirt, unremarkable except for the way he carried himself, centered, balanced, ready. Steven Seagal had been watching the entire confrontation unfold from across the park, and what he'd seen had triggered something in him that couldn't be ignored. "I said that's enough," Steven repeated, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who'd faced down much more dangerous opponents than a neighborhood bully. The boy said no. That should be the end of it. Big Tone's confusion was evident. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. Nobody interfered with his business. Nobody stood up to him. Certainly not some random old guy in clothes that looked like they came from a thrift store. "Old man," Big Tone said, his voice carrying the tone of someone explaining something to a child. "You need to walk away. Right now, before this becomes your problem too." Steven took a step closer, his movement fluid and controlled. "I'm afraid it's already my problem. See, I don't like bullies. And I really don't like people who hurt children." The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, drawn by the commotion. Someone in the back whispered, "Is that?" "No, it can't be." But word began to spread through the crowd like wildfire. Luis looked up at his unexpected defender with confusion and hope. He didn't know who this man was, but he could see something in Steven's eyes that reminded him of his father. The same quiet strength, the same unwavering moral compass. Big Tone straightened to his full height, using his size to intimidate as he'd done countless times before. "Mister, you got exactly 5 seconds to walk away before I make you wish you'd minded your own business." Steven's response was to calmly pick up one of Luis's cookies from the ground, brushing off the dirt with gentle care. He took a bite and smiled. "Your grandmother had good taste, son. This is excellent." The simple act of kindness, of treating Luis with dignity in the middle of a crisis, broke something loose in the boy's chest. For the first time since the confrontation began, Luis felt like maybe, just maybe, things might be okay. Big Tone's patience finally snapped completely. "That's it. You just bought yourself a world of hurt, old man." He reached into his waistband and pulled out a small switchblade, the metal catching the afternoon sun. "Last chance to walk away." Steven's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle realignment that spoke of decades of training and experience. "Put the knife away, son. You don't want to do this." "Yeah." Big Tone snarled, advancing with the blade extended. "Watch me." What happened next would be talked about in the neighborhood for years to come. Big Tone lunged forward with the confident aggression of someone who'd won every fight through intimidation and superior size. Steven moved like water, flowing around the attack with an economy of motion that made the violence look almost like dance. In less than 3 seconds, Big Tone was face first on the pavement with Steven's knee pressed gently but firmly against his back. The knife had skittered away across the concrete, spinning to rest near Mr. Hakim's fruit stand. It's over, Stephen said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. Let it go. Big Tone struggled for a moment, then went limp as the reality of his situation sank in. For the first time in years, he was the one on the ground, helpless and humiliated. The neighborhood enforcer had been neutralized by a man who looked like he belonged in a grocery store, not a fighting ring. Luis stared in amazement, his tears forgotten. Wow, he whispered. Are you a superhero? Stephen's smile was warm and genuine. No, son. I'm just someone who thinks children should be able to sell cookies without getting hassled by bullies. From the crowd, someone called out, That's Steven Seagal. Holy shit, that's really him. The whispers grew louder as recognition spread through the gathered onlookers. Cell phones appeared, cameras clicking and recording. The confrontation had just become something much bigger than a simple shakedown. Big Tone groaned against the pavement, the weight of his humiliation crushing him more than Stephen's knee ever could. In front of phones and cameras, in front of a neighborhood that had feared him for years, he'd been taken down by a man who looked like somebody's grandfather. Mr. Seagal, Luis said, his voice filled with awe, thank you for protecting Rose's money. Stephen gently helped Luis to his feet, his movements careful and respectful. You did the right thing, son. Standing up for your sister, refusing to compromise on what matters. That takes real courage. Your father would be proud. The mention of his father brought fresh tears to Luis's eyes, but these were different tears, tears of relief and validation rather than fear and frustration. How did you know about my papa? I can see it in you, Stephen said simply. The way you carry yourself, the way you stand up for what's right even when you're scared. That doesn't come from nowhere. Someone taught you well. As sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. By the second, the park began to transform around them. What had been a place of fear and intimidation was slowly becoming something else. A place where justice had been served, where a child's courage had been defended, and where a community had witnessed something extraordinary. The scattered cookies and crumpled money suddenly seemed less important than the larger truth that had been revealed. Sometimes, when good people stand together, the bullies don't win. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park as Stephen Seagal maintained his calm hold on Big Tone, who lay face down on the pavement with the resigned stillness of someone who'd finally met his match. The crowd had grown larger, drawn by the commotion and the whispered recognition that was spreading through the gathered onlookers like wildfire. Stephen's movements were deliberate and controlled as he slowly released his grip on Big Tone, stepping back with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of controlled violence. His gray t-shirt was barely wrinkled, his breathing steady and calm, as if subduing a knife-wielding enforcer was no more strenuous than his morning Tai Chi routine. Stay down, Stephen said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be obeyed. Think about what brought you here, and think about where you want to go from here. Big Tone pushed himself up to his knees slowly, his face a mixture of humiliation and dawning realization. The knife lay forgotten several feet away, its threat neutralized as completely as its wielder. For the first time in years, Antonio Ruiz found himself on the receiving end of the fear he'd spent so long cultivating in others. You don't know who you're messing with, old man, Big Tone said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. The words sounded hollow, like an actor reciting lines from a play he no longer believed in. Stephen's response was to walk calmly over to Luis's overturned table, beginning to collect the scattered cookies with the same careful attention he might give to arranging flowers. Each movement was purposeful, respectful of the boy's effort and the love that had gone into creating these small tokens of hope. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Stephen said without looking up from his task. A man who's forgotten the difference between strength and bullying. A man who thinks intimidating children makes him powerful. He picked up an unbroken chocolate chip cookie, examining it with genuine appreciation before taking a careful bite. His expression brightened with surprise and pleasure. Luis, this is exceptional. Your grandmother's recipe? Luis nodded, his eyes wide with amazement at how quickly everything had changed. Minutes ago, he'd been cowering on the ground while his dreams scattered in the wind. Now a real-life action hero was complimenting his baking and treating him with the kind of respect he'd only ever received from his family. She taught me the secret, Luis said, his voice stronger now, but still filled with awe. You have to stir clockwise while thinking happy thoughts about the people you love. Wise woman, Stephen said, carefully wrapping the remaining cookies in tissue paper that had survived the confrontation. Love is always the most important ingredient. The crowd pressed closer, phones capturing every moment of this unexpected encounter. Word had spread beyond the immediate vicinity. People were arriving from blocks away, drawn by social media posts and text messages describing the scene unfolding in Lincoln Park. Marisol had been watching in stunned silence, her maternal instincts warring between the need to protect her son and the recognition that this stranger had just done what she couldn't, stood up to the neighborhood's most feared enforcer and won. Now she stepped forward hesitantly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Mr. Seagal," she said, the name still seeming impossible on her lips. "I don't know how to thank you. Luis, he's been working so hard for his sister and this man." She gestured toward Big Tone, her voice failing as the magnitude of what had almost happened hit her fully. Stephen looked up from his careful restoration of Luis's cookie display, his expression gentle and understanding. "Ma'am, your son did something today that most adults wouldn't have the courage to do. He stood up for what was right, even when it scared him, even when it would have been easier to give in." He turned to face Big Tone, who was still kneeling on the pavement, his earlier swagger replaced by something approaching shame. "As for this gentleman, I think he's starting to understand that real strength isn't about making people afraid of. You humiliated me," Big Tone said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In front of everyone. Do you know what that means in my world?" Stephen's expression softened slightly, recognizing something familiar in the enforcer's tone. The lost sound of a man who'd built his entire identity on a foundation that had just crumbled beneath him. "I know what it means," Stephen said quietly. "It means you have a choice to make. You can stay in a world where your worth is measured by how much fear you can generate, or you can choose to build something better." He gestured toward Luis, who was now carefully counting his recovered money. This boy chose to build something better. He chose to help his sister instead of feeling sorry for himself. He chose to work instead of taking shortcuts. And when you tried to destroy that, he chose to protect it even though he was terrified. Big Tone's hands clenched into fists, but there was no violence in the gesture. Only the struggle of a man wrestling with truths he'd spent years avoiding. "You don't understand. This neighborhood, the way things work here. If word gets out that I went soft, that I let some kid disrespect me." "Word's already out," Stevens said, nodding toward the crowd of phone-wielding witnesses. "The question is what story you want people to tell about this day." Luis had been listening to this exchange with the rapt attention of a child witnessing adults navigate complexities he couldn't fully understand. But something in Big Tone's voice, something vulnerable and almost familiar, prompted him to speak. "Mr. Tone," Luis said, his young voice cutting through the tension like a bell. "Are you sad?" The question caught everyone off guard, especially Big Tone himself. Children had a way of cutting through pretense that adults had learned to navigate around, and Luis's innocent directness hit him like a physical blow. "What?" Big Tone looked up, his face a mask of confusion. "You seem sad," Luis continued, his natural empathy overriding his fear. "Like when I'm worried about Rosa. Are you worried about someone too?" For a moment, the mask slipped completely, and everyone present could see the frightened, lonely man underneath the intimidating exterior. Big Tone's phone buzzed in his pocket. Another reminder from the nursing home about his mother's medication schedule, and his face crumpled slightly. "Kid, you don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice lacked any real hostility. Stephen watched this exchange with growing understanding. He'd seen enough broken men to recognize the signs, the way Big Tone's fingers unconsciously moved toward his phone, the slight softening of his features when Luis asked about his sadness, the defensive posture of someone protecting something vulnerable. "Everyone's fighting battles that others can't see," Stephen said gently. "The difference is whether we choose to fight those battles by building people up or tearing them down." Mr. Hakim, who had been watching from his fruit stand with the concerned expression of a grandfather witnessing his neighborhood's transformation, finally found his voice. "Mr. Ruiz," he said carefully, using Big Tone's real name like an invitation back to humanity. "Perhaps this is a good day for new beginnings, yes?" The elderly vendor's words carried the weight of years spent watching young men like Antonio Ruiz get lost in cycles of violence and desperation. Hakeem had seen neighborhoods destroyed by fear and rebuilt by hope, and he recognized this moment as a crucial turning point. Big Tone looked around at the faces surrounding him, some fearful, some curious, but none as hostile as he'd expected. For years, he'd been the neighborhood's boogeyman, the shadow that made vendors nervous and children cross the street. Now, flat on his back after being humbled by a man old enough to be his father, he was seeing these people as human beings for the first time in longer than he could remember. "I don't know how to be anything else," he said finally, his voice so quiet that only those closest could hear him. "This is all I know." Stephen extended his hand toward Big Tone, the gesture simple but profound. Learning to be something different starts with accepting help when it's offered. The enforcer stared at the offered hand for a long moment, decades of distrust and violence warring with something newer and more fragile, the possibility of redemption. The crowd held its breath, sensing that they were witnessing something larger than a simple fight resolution. Slowly, carefully, Big Tone reached up and grasped Stephen's hand, allowing himself to be pulled to his feet. It was a small gesture, but in the context of everything that had just happened, it felt monumental. "This doesn't change anything," Big Tone said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I still got responsibilities. People depending on me." "Of course you do," Stephen agreed. "The question is whether you want to meet those responsibilities through fear or through respect. Whether you want to be remembered as someone who terrorized children or someone who protected them." Luis, who had been watching this adult drama unfold with the fascination of a child witnessing something both confusing and important, suddenly brightened with an idea. "Mr. Tone," he said, his voice carrying the hopeful enthusiasm that had marked his entire cookie-selling venture. "Would you like to buy a cookie? There's still only $2, and every penny goes to help Rosa get better." The simple offer hung in the air like a bridge between two worlds. The world where Big Tone was a feared enforcer, and the world where he was simply a man being offered a chance to help a sick little girl. Big Tone looked down at the boy's earnest face, at the carefully rebuilt display of cookies, at the crumpled bills that Luis had painstakingly collected from the pavement. For the first time in years, someone was offering him a chance to be part of something good. "Yeah, kid," he said quietly, reaching into his pocket for his wallet. "I think I'd like that." The moment Big Tone reached for his wallet instead of another weapon, something fundamental shifted in the atmosphere of Lincoln Park. The crowd that had gathered to witness what they thought might be a brutal confrontation found themselves instead watching something far more powerful. The transformation of a man who had spent years defining himself through violence and intimidation. But Big Tone's two companions, who had been watching their leader's humiliation with growing alarm, weren't ready to accept this new reality. The thinner of the two, a wiry man with nervous eyes named Carlos, stepped forward with the desperate aggression of someone whose worldview was crumbling before his eyes. "Tone, what the hell are you doing?" Carlos hissed, his voice carrying the sharp edge of panic. "You gonna let this old man make you look like a punk in front of the whole neighborhood?" The second enforcer, a younger man with gang tattoos covering his neck, nodded emphatically. "This is bullshit, man. We got a reputation to maintain. People gonna think we gone soft." Stephen sensed the shift in energy before anyone else, his decades of experience in dangerous situations alerting him to the fact that the confrontation was far from over. While he'd successfully neutralized the immediate threat from Big Tone, the larger dynamic of gang hierarchy and street credibility was now in play. "Your friends seem to have different ideas about how this should end," Stephen observed calmly, positioning himself subtly between the two enforcers and Luis, who was still clutching his precious cash box. Big Tone looked at his companions with something approaching disgust. For years, he'd surrounded himself with men who fed off violence and fear, never questioning whether the power they wielded actually made them stronger or just more isolated from everything good in the world. "Carlos, Marcus," Big Tone said slowly, his voice carrying a new weight. "Stand down. Stand down." Carlos's voice cracked with disbelief. "Man, you lost your mind? This dude just punked you in front of half the neighborhood, and you want us to stand down?" The crowd had grown larger still, with people arriving continuously as word spread through social media and text messages. Someone had started live streaming the encounter, and the viewer count was climbing rapidly as people shared the surreal spectacle of Steven Seagal defending a child's cookie stand in a Chicago park. Marcus, the younger enforcer, was clearly struggling with conflicting loyalties. Tone, I don't understand what's happening here. This ain't how we do things. This ain't who we are. Maybe that's the problem, Big Tone said quietly, his eyes still fixed on Luis, who was watching this adult drama unfold with the wide-eyed attention of a child witnessing something he sensed was important but couldn't fully comprehend. Stephen stepped forward slightly, his movement drawing the attention of both enforcers. Gentlemen, your friend is making a smart choice. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is admit when he's been wrong. Shut up, old man, Carlos snarled, his hand moving toward his waistband. This ain't about right and wrong. This is about respect. This is about not letting nobody disrespect our crew. The gesture was subtle, but Stephen caught it immediately. His body shifted almost imperceptibly, weight distributed and ready, though his expression remained calm and non-threatening. I'd think very carefully about your next move, son. Luis, sensing the rising tension, took a step closer to Stephen, his small hand finding the action star's arm. Mr. Seagal, are they going to hurt you? The innocence of the question cut through the posturing like a blade. Here was a 10-year-old boy who had just been terrorized and humiliated, now worried about the safety of the man who had protected him. The purity of that concern seemed to shame everyone present. No, Luis, Stephen said gently, his voice carrying absolute certainty. Nobody's going to get hurt today. Are you, gentlemen? Carlos's hand froze halfway to his weapon, the implied threat in Stephen's tone stopping him cold. There was something in the older man's eyes, a calm confidence that spoke of experiences and capabilities that Carlos couldn't even imagine. Marisol, who had been watching from the sidelines with her heart hammering against her ribs, suddenly found her voice. Please, she called out, her accent thick with emotion. My son, he just wants to help his sister. Why can't you just leave us alone? The plea of a frightened mother seemed to snap something inside Marcus. He was young enough to still remember his own mother's voice, young enough to recognize the universal sound of maternal fear and desperation. Man, this is messed up, Marcus said, taking a step back. Carlos, we're talking about shaking down. A little kid here. When did we become the kind of people who do that? We became that kind of people when we decided to survive in this neighborhood. Carlos shot back, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. You think anybody's going to respect us after this? You think anybody's going to pay up if word gets out that we let some Hollywood has been punk us? Stephen's laugh was soft and genuinely amused. Has been? Son, I think you might be surprised at what this old has been is still capable of. As if to demonstrate his point, Stephen casually reached down and picked up the switchblade that Big Tone had dropped earlier. With movements too quick to follow clearly, he opened and closed the blade several times, the metal singing as it moved, before finally closing it completely and sliding it into his pocket. Knife safety is important, he said mildly. Somebody could get hurt. The display was so casual, so effortlessly controlled, that it sent a chill through both remaining enforcers. This wasn't some aging actor trading on past glories. This was a man who clearly still possessed the skills that had made him famous. Carlos's bravado finally cracked completely. Tone, man, I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but I ain't sticking around for this. This is crazy. He began backing away, his earlier aggression replaced by the survival instinct of someone who'd finally recognized that he was outmatched. You want to throw away everything we built here for some kid's cookie stand? That's on you. But I'm out. Big Tone watched his lieutenant retreat with something that might have been relief. Carlos, take Marcus and go cool off. Think about what kind of men you want to be. What kind of men we want to be. Carlos's voice rose to a near shout. We're gang members, Tone. We're criminals. We ain't supposed to be buying cookies from little kids. Maybe that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing, Big Tone said quietly, pulling a $20 bill from his wallet and placing it on Luis's makeshift table. Kid, give me 4 cookies and keep the change. The gesture was simple, but its implications rippled through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. Antonio Ruiz, the neighborhood's most feared enforcer, had just chosen to support a child's fundraiser instead of extorting from it. Luis's face lit up with joy so pure and genuine that it seemed to illuminate the entire park. "Really, Mr. Tone? You want to help Rosa?" "Yeah, kid," Big Tone said, his voice rough with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I want to help Rosa." Stephen watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction, recognizing the moment when a man's life trajectory changed completely. He'd seen it before in his years of law enforcement and community work, the instant when someone chose to step out of a cycle of violence and into something better. Carlos and Marcus had retreated to the edge of the crowd, clearly torn between loyalty to their leader and confusion about what his transformation might mean for their own futures. The neighborhood dynamics that had seemed so fixed and permanent were shifting like sand in an earthquake. Mr. Hakim, sensing that the crisis had passed, began applauding slowly, his weathered hands creating a rhythm that others gradually joined. Soon the entire crowd was clapping, not for the violence that had been avoided, but for the transformation they had witnessed. "This is what community looks like," Stephen said, his voice carrying to the entire gathered crowd. "This is what happens when people choose to protect what matters instead of destroying it." Luis carefully wrapped 4 cookies in tissue paper, his small hands working with the same loving attention he'd given to every sale of the day. But when he handed them to Big Tone, he included something extra, a small drawing that Rosa had made for the cookie stand, showing a stick figure girl running under a rainbow. "Rosa drew this," Luis explained. "She wanted everyone who bought cookies to know that she's grateful, even though she can't be here today." Big Tone stared at the simple drawing for a long moment, his eyes suspiciously bright. In Rosa's innocent artwork, he saw something he'd forgotten existed: hope without cynicism, gratitude without calculation, love without conditions. "Tell Rosa that Mr. Tone hopes she gets better real soon," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell her she's got friends in this neighborhood." The moment stretched between them, gang enforcer and 10-year-old boy, connected by something larger than the circumstances that had brought them together. Around them, the crowd continued to applaud, sensing that they had witnessed something rare and precious, the moment when someone chose redemption over revenge, community over conflict. Stephen stepped back slightly, allowing Big Tone and Luis to have their moment, while keeping a watchful eye on Carlos and Marcus, who were still hovering uncertainly at the edge of the crowd. The immediate crisis had passed, but he knew that real change took time to solidify. "Mr. Seagal," Luis said suddenly, turning to his protector with eyes bright with excitement. "Would you like a cookie too? Rosa would want you to have one." Stephen's smile was warm and genuine. "I would be honored to have one of Rosa's cookies, Luis. But let me pay for it properly." As Stephen reached for his wallet, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the celebratory atmosphere. Someone in the crowd had called the police, and the authorities were finally arriving to deal with a situation that had already resolved itself in the most unexpected way possible. Detective Jamie Ortiz was the first officer on the scene, his experienced eyes quickly taking in the unusual tableau. A famous action star standing next to a child's cookie stand, a known gang enforcer holding what appeared to be children's artwork, and a crowd of neighborhood residents who seemed more celebratory than frightened. "Well," Detective Ortiz said dryly, approaching the group with the measured caution of someone who'd seen too many situations go wrong too quickly. "This is interesting." Detective Jamie Ortiz had been working the Lincoln Park beat for 8 years, long enough to recognize trouble in all its forms and wise enough to know that sometimes the absence of trouble was more suspicious than its presence. As he approached the crowd gathered around Luis's cookie stand, his experienced eyes cataloged details with the automatic precision of someone trained to read the street like a book. The crowd was too relaxed for a violent incident. Steven Seagal was calmly eating a cookie while chatting with a 10-year-old boy. Big Tone, Antonio Ruiz, according to his file, was holding what appeared to be a child's drawing and looking more contemplative than threatening. And somehow, impossibly, everyone seemed to be getting along. "Somebody want to tell me what happened here?" Detective Ortiz asked, his voice carrying the weary authority of a man who'd seen everything at least twice. A dozen voices began speaking at once, each witness eager to share their version of the extraordinary events they'd just witnessed. The detective held up his hand for silence, his attention focusing on the central figures of whatever drama had unfolded. "Mr. Seagal," he said, recognizing the action star immediately. "I'm Detective Ortiz. Mind if I ask what brings you to our neighborhood?" Stephen's response was characteristically calm and direct. "I live about 6 blocks from here, Detective. I was taking my afternoon walk when I saw this young man being harassed by someone who seemed to think children owe him money." Detective Ortiz's gaze shifted to Big Tone, whose presence in the park was far less surprising but equally puzzling given the current peaceful atmosphere. "Antonio, what's your version of events?" Big Tone looked down at Rose's drawing in his hands, then back at the detective who'd been trying to build a case against him for years. "I made a mistake, Detective. A big one. Mr. Seagal helped me see that." The admission was so unexpected that Detective Ortiz actually took a step back. In 8 years of dealing with Antonio Ruiz, he'd never heard the man admit to anything more serious than jaywalking, and even then only when caught on video. "What kind of mistake?" Ortiz asked carefully, his hand unconsciously moving closer to his radio. "The kind where you forget that there's a difference between being feared and being respected," Big Tone said quietly. "The kind where you think taking money from kids makes you strong instead of making you the worst kind of weak." Luis, who had been watching this exchange with the fascination of a child seeing adults navigate complex emotions, suddenly spoke. "Up. Detective Ortiz, Mr. Tone bought 4 cookies for Rosa? He gave me $20 and said to keep the change." The innocence of the boy's excitement seemed to pierce through the tension like sunlight through clouds. Detective Ortiz looked from Luis to Big Tone to Stephen, trying to reconcile what he was hearing with everything he thought he knew about the neighborhood's dynamics. "Luis, is it?" Detective Ortiz crouched down to the boy's eye level, his voice gentling in the way cops learned when dealing with children. "Can you tell me what happened here? From the beginning?" Luis's account was delivered with the breathless enthusiasm of a child recounting an adventure, complete with dramatic gestures and careful attention to details he considered important. He described setting up his cookie stand, Big Tone's arrival and demands for money, the scattering of his cash and cookies, and Stephen's intervention with the wide-eyed wonder of someone who still couldn't quite believe it had all really happened. And then Mr. Seagal did this amazing move, whoosh. And Mr. Tone was on the ground, but not hurt, just stopped. Like when you pause a video game. Luis demonstrated with elaborate hand gestures that bore no resemblance to actual martial arts, but captured the essence of what he'd witnessed. Detective Ortiz listened to the entire account without interruption, occasionally glancing at the other adults to gauge their reactions. What struck him most was not just what Luis was saying, but how he was saying it, with excitement rather than trauma, with gratitude rather than fear. "Mr. Ruiz," Detective Ortiz said, standing and facing Big Tone directly. "This boy is describing extortion, destruction of property, and assault. You want to tell me he's wrong?" Big Tone met the detective's gaze steadily, something he'd rarely done in their previous encounters. "No, Detective. He's not wrong. I did all that and worse. I tried to steal money from a kid who was raising funds for his sick sister." The crowd had gone quiet, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Antonio Ruiz was confessing to crimes in front of dozens of witnesses and at least 3 people who were live streaming the encounter. "I could arrest you right now," Detective Ortiz said slowly. "Multiple charges. The DA would love to finally get you in front of a judge." "I know," Big Tone said simply. "And maybe you should. Maybe that's what needs to happen." Stephen, who had been allowing the scene to unfold without interference, finally stepped forward. "Detective, if I may suggest something?" Ortiz nodded, curious to hear what the action star might propose. "This man made a mistake today, but he also made a choice to correct it. He's standing here confessing to crimes he could easily deny, buying cookies from a boy he could have continued to intimidate. Maybe the question isn't what he deserves for what he did wrong, but what the community needs for him to do right. Community service?" Detective Ortiz asked skeptically. "For extortion and assault? Community investment," Stephen corrected. "The difference between punishment that isolates and consequence that integrates." Mr. Hakim, who had been listening to this exchange with the growing excitement of someone who'd lived long enough to appreciate true wisdom, suddenly clapped his hands together. "Yes, this is exactly right. Mr. Ruiz, you want to make amends?" You help this neighborhood become better instead of more afraid. The suggestion hung in the air, revolutionary in its simplicity. Rather than removing Big Tone from the community, through incarceration, they were proposing to transform his role within it. What kind of community investment? Detective Ortiz asked, his cop's skepticism warring with recognition that traditional justice hadn't been particularly effective in dealing with Antonio Ruiz. Luis, who had been following the adult conversation with impressive focus, suddenly brightened with an idea. Mr. Tone could help me sell cookies. He's really big and people notice him. He could help me raise even more money for Rosa. The suggestion was so innocent, so completely free of cynicism or calculation, that it stopped all conversation. The idea of Antonio Ruiz, the neighborhood's most feared enforcer, becoming a spokesperson for a child's fundraising effort was so absurd it was almost beautiful. Big Tone stared at Luis for a long moment, something working behind his eyes. Kid, you know what people think when they see me, right? You know I ain't exactly the friendly face you want representing your cause. But that's what would make it special, Luis said with the unshakable logic of childhood. If you help Rosa, then everyone will know that you're not scary anymore. They'll know you're good. The simple faith in his statement hit Big Tone like a physical blow. This boy had just been terrorized and humiliated by him, had watched his dreams scattered across the pavement, and he was offering redemption without conditions or guarantees. Detective, Big Tone said slowly, his voice rough with emotion. What if I pled guilty to everything? Everything the kid said, everything you've been trying to prove for years. But instead of jail time, what if I worked off my debt to this community by helping kids like Luis? Detective Ortiz was quiet for a long moment, calculating angles and implications. You're talking about a pretty significant departure from standard procedure. Sometimes standard procedure doesn't create the change we actually need, Stephen observed. Sometimes it just perpetuates the cycles that created the problem in the first place. Marisol, who had been listening to this conversation with the amazed attention of someone watching her worst nightmare transform into unexpected hope, finally found her voice. Mr. Ruiz, you would really help Luis? Help other children? Big Tone looked at her, seeing not just another victim to intimidate, but a mother working multiple jobs to save her daughter's life. A woman who'd raised a son brave enough to stand up to men twice his size for the sake of someone he loved. Ma'am, I spent years making this neighborhood worse. Maybe it's time I tried making it better. Detective Ortiz pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found the number he wanted. I'm going to call the DA's office. See if they're interested in something creative. But Ruiz, understand this. You mess up, you disappoint that kid even once, and I'll throw every charge I can think of at you. We clear? Crystal, Big Tone said, then turned to Luis. Kid, you sure you want my help? People might not understand. Might think you're making a deal with the devil. Luis considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important decisions. My papa used to say that everyone deserves a second chance if they're really sorry and really want to change. Are you really sorry, Mr. Tone? The question was asked with such directness, such absence of guile, that it cut through every defense Big Tone had ever constructed. Yeah, kid, I'm really sorry. And do you really want to change? Big Tone looked around at the crowd of faces, some hopeful, some skeptical, all watching to see what he would choose. Yeah, Luis, I really want to change. Luis's smile was bright enough to power the entire neighborhood. Then welcome to Team Rosa, Mr. Tone. The boy's enthusiasm was infectious, and despite everything that had happened, despite the surreal nature of the entire situation, Big Tone found himself smiling back. Team Rosa it is, kid. Stephen watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction, recognizing the moment when a community chose healing over revenge, growth over punishment. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something rarer and more valuable, transformative. Justice. Detective, Stephen said quietly. I think you're about to witness something pretty special happen in this neighborhood. Detective Ortiz looked around at the assembled crowd, at the unlikely partnership forming between a gang enforcer and a 10-year-old boy, at the action star who'd somehow catalyzed a transformation that years of traditional law enforcement hadn't achieved. Mr. Seagal, he said with a slight smile, I think you might be right. Word spread through the neighborhood with the velocity that only good news can achieve. Within an hour of Detective Ortiz's phone call to the DA's office, Luis's cookie stand had been transformed from a simple fundraising effort into something approaching a block party. People emerged from apartments and shops, drawn by social media, posts, text messages, and the old-fashioned power of neighbors talking to neighbors. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Mrs. Chun from the Korean grocery store arrived with her teenage daughter, both carrying bags of homemade kimchi that they insisted Luis sell alongside his cookies, with all proceeds going to Rose's fund. The elderly Irish men who'd been playing cards abandoned their game to form an impromptu security detail, joking that anyone who messed with Luis would have to answer to them. "This is incredible, Mijo," Marisol whispered to Luis as she watched a steady stream of customers approach their now expanded operation. Her cleaning supply table had been moved aside to make room for the growing collection of donated items and volunteer helpers. Luis was practically vibrating with excitement as he counted and recounted the money flowing into his cash box. "Mama, look." Mr. Johnson from the hardware store bought 6 cookies, and Mrs. Martinez brought her whole family. And the teenagers, from the basketball court, they pooled their money for a dozen. The teenagers in question were still gathered around the stand, taking selfies with Luis and playfully calling him Little Boss and the Cookie King. What had started as curiosity about the viral videos circulating on social media had turned into genuine admiration for the boy's courage and determination. Stephen remained on the periphery of the celebration, content to watch the community transformation he'd helped catalyze. His intervention had lasted only minutes, but its ripple effects were continuing to spread in ways that even he hadn't anticipated. This was the kind of victory he'd learned to appreciate in his years of community work, not the dramatic takedown of a villain, but the slower, more sustainable triumph of people choosing to support each other. "Mr. Seagal," a voice called from behind him. He turned to see a young woman with a press badge and a camera crew in tow. "I'm Lisa Rodriguez from Channel 7 News. Could we get a few minutes for an interview about what happened here today?" Stephen's smile was polite but firm. "I appreciate the interest, but I think you should be talking to Luis and his family. This is their story." The reporter persisted, recognizing the value of having a celebrity angle for her story. "But you're the one who stopped the extortion. Our viewers would love to hear about what motivated you to step in." "What motivated me," Stephen said calmly, "is the same thing that motivated everyone else here today. We saw a child who needed help, and we chose to help him. That's not news. That's just being human." Before the reporter could respond, Luis appeared at Stephen's side, tugging gently on his sleeve. "Mr. Seagal, Mrs. Rodriguez wants to interview me for TV. She says Rosa might see it in the hospital." Stephen's expression softened immediately. "That's wonderful, Luis. Rosa will be so proud to see her big brother on television." As the reporter began setting up for the interview, Stephen noticed Big Tone standing uncertainly at the edge of the crowd, clearly wanting to participate but unsure of his welcome. The transformation from neighborhood enforcer to community member was going to take time, and Stephen recognized the vulnerability in Antonio's posture. "Antonio," Stephen called, using the man's real name deliberately. "Come help Luis with his interview. Team Rosa, remember?" Big Tone's face showed a mixture of gratitude and nervousness as he approached. "You think that's a good idea? Me on camera talking about helping kids? People know who I am, what I've done." "That's exactly why it's important," Stephen said quietly. "People need to see that change is possible, that someone can choose to be better than they were." Luis, overhearing this conversation, looked up at Big Tone with the earnest expression he wore whenever he was about to say something he considered very important. "Mr. Tone, you should definitely be on TV with me. Rosa will want to meet you when she gets better. She likes meeting new friends." The simple acceptance in the boy's voice seemed to settle something in Big Tone's chest. He nodded slowly, straightening his shoulders with newfound resolve. "Okay, kid. If you think Rosa would want to meet me, then I guess I better make sure I'm someone worth meeting." As the camera crew finished their setup, more neighbors continued to arrive. The Arab teenagers who ran the coffee cart had wheeled their operation over to provide free drinks to anyone who made a donation to Rosa's fund. A group of young black artists who sold paintings in the park had contributed several pieces to a silent auction, with all proceeds going to the medical fund. Mr. Hakim was in his element, orchestrating the chaos with the gentle authority of a man who'd spent decades watching communities come together in times of need. Luis, my boy, you need to keep better records of all this money coming in. Here, let me help you organize. The elderly fruit vendor produced a small notebook from his pocket and began carefully documenting each donation, his handwriting precise despite his age. Your mother will need these records for the hospital and the tax people too. We do this right, yes? Marisol watched her neighbor's kindness with tears in her eyes. She'd been struggling alone for so long that the sight of an entire community rallying around her family felt almost surreal. Mr. Hakim, I don't know how to thank you. Any of you. You don't thank family, Hakim replied with a dismissive wave. This neighborhood, we're all family. Sometimes we forget, but days like today remind us. Detective Ortiz returned from his phone call with the DA's office, his expression mixing professional satisfaction with personal amazement. Good news, he announced to the gathered crowd. The district attorney's office is interested in Mr. Ruiz's community service proposal. Assuming he follows through on his commitments, they're willing to consider alternative sentencing. A small cheer went up from the crowd, but Big Tone himself seemed almost overwhelmed by the support. Detective, I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this to avoid consequences. I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. I know, Detective Ortiz said simply. That's why I think it might actually work. The news interview began with Luis positioned behind his cookie stand, Big Tone standing slightly behind him like an unlikely bodyguard. Stephen had politely declined to be on camera, preferring to watch from the background as the real stars of the story took center stage. So Luis, the reporter began. Can you tell our viewers what happened here today? Luis launched into his story with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found his calling as a storyteller. He described his mission to help Rosa, the confrontation with Big Tone, Stephen's intervention, and the community's response with the kind of detail and emotional honesty that made for compelling television. And Mr. Ruiz, the reporter said, turning to Big Tone, you were initially trying to extort money from Luis. What changed your mind? Big Tone was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I saw a kid who was braver than I was. A kid who was willing to stand up for what mattered, even when he was scared. Made me realize I'd forgotten what courage actually looks like. What does this mean for your future? Are you leaving gang life behind? I'm choosing to be part of something that builds instead of something that tears down, Big Tone said, his hand resting gently on Luis's shoulder. This kid and his sister, they showed me what's worth fighting for. Luis beamed up at his new partner with the radiant joy of someone who discovered that the world contained more goodness than he'd ever imagined. Mr. Tone is going to help me sell cookies every weekend until Rosa gets better. We're Team Rosa. The interview continued for several more minutes, but the heart of the story was already clear. A child's courage and an unexpected protector had catalyzed something larger than either of them, a community remembering what it meant to take care of each other. As the camera crew packed up their equipment, Luis's cash box had grown heavier than he could easily carry. The exact count would have to wait, but rough estimates suggested he'd raised more money in 4 hours than he'd hoped to raise in 4 months. Rosa is going to be so happy, Luis said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at the overflowing donations. She's going to be able to run and play just like other kids. Stephen, who had been watching the afternoon's transformation with quiet satisfaction, finally approached Luis for a private moment. Luis, I want you to know something important. What you did today, standing up for your sister, refusing to back down even when you were scared, that's the most important kind of strength there is. Really? Luis asked, his eyes wide with the need for validation that all children carry. Really, Stephen confirmed. Most adults wouldn't have had your courage. Your father would be incredibly proud. Luis's face crumpled slightly at the mention of his father, but it was happy crying rather than sad. I wish he could have met you, Mr. Seagal. I think you would have been friends. I think so too, Stephen said gently. And I think he would have loved seeing how his son turned out. How you take care of the people you love. Big Tone, who had been helping Mr. Hakim organize the donation records, overheard this conversation and approached hesitantly. Luis, I know I can't undo what I did earlier, but I want you to know that meeting you changed something important in me. You showed me who I want to be. Luis looked between Stephen and Big Tone, these two very different men who had both become part of his story in ways he was still trying to understand. Maybe that's what Team Rosa is really about, he said with the wisdom that sometimes emerges from the mouths of children, helping people become who they want to be. The crowd had begun to thin slightly as the afternoon wore on, but the energy remained festive and warm. Neighbors exchanged contact information, making plans to continue supporting Luis's fundraising efforts. The teenagers promised to spread the word at school. Mrs. Chin offered to teach Luis some basic Korean phrases so he could thank her customers properly. As the sun began to set over Lincoln Park, casting long golden shadows across the transformed marketplace, Marisol finally allowed herself to believe that everything might actually be okay. Her son was safe. Rosa's medical fund had grown exponentially, and a community she'd barely known existed had embraced her family with open arms. "Mijo," she said to Luis as they began packing up the remaining cookies. "What do you want to tell Rosa when we call her tonight?" Luis considered this question with the seriousness he brought to all important decisions. "I want to tell her that she has friends she hasn't even met yet, and that sometimes when bad things happen, they turn into the best things." Stephen, who was preparing to leave, overheard this and smiled. It was the kind of wisdom that reminded him why he'd chosen to step in, why some fights were worth having, and why protecting innocence was always the right choice. "Luis," he said, "I'll be back next weekend to see how Team Rosa is doing. Save me a cookie?" "I'll save you too," Luis promised, his grin wide enough to light up the gathering dusk. "One for you, and one for Rosa when she gets better and can come to the park." As Stephen walked away into the evening shadows, he could hear the continuing chatter and laughter behind him. A neighborhood had been transformed, a child's courage had been protected, and a man had found his way back to humanity. It hadn't required explosions or chase scenes, just the simple decision to stand up for what was right. Behind him, Team Rosa was already making plans for next weekend, their voices carrying across the park like a promise that some stories have the happiest possible endings. 3 weeks later, Lincoln Park had settled into a new rhythm. Luis's cookie stand had become a weekend fixture, but now it was more than just a fundraiser. It had evolved into the neighborhood's unofficial community center. Children gathered there to share stories, elderly residents stopped by for conversation, and teenagers volunteered to help with sales. Rosa made her first appearance on a sunny Saturday morning, still pale, but with color returning to her cheeks. She moved carefully, but her eyes sparkled with excitement as she saw the Team Rosa banner that Big Tone had commissioned from the local sign shop. "Mijo, is this really all for me?" Rosa whispered to Luis, overwhelmed by the attention and love surrounding her. "It's for you, but it's also for everyone," Luis explained with newfound wisdom. "Sometimes when you help one person, you end up helping everybody." Big Tone arrived carrying a small folding chair painted pink, Rosa's favorite color, which he'd made himself in his apartment's cramped workspace. The gesture was awkward but genuine, his massive hands trembling slightly as he presented it to the little girl. "Thank you, Mr. Tone," Rosa said with the formal politeness of a child meeting someone important. "Luis told me you're part of our team now. If you'll have me," Big Tone said quietly, his voice catching slightly. 1 month after the confrontation, Lincoln Park had transformed into something unrecognizable from its fearful past. Stephen's morning Tai Chi sessions now drew small crowds of curious neighbors, with Luis always in the front row, attempting to mirror the graceful movements with enthusiastic imprecision. "Remember, Luis," Stephen said patiently, "it's not about the perfect form. It's about finding your center, your balance." Rosa sat nearby in her pink chair, sketching the Tai Chi group with colored pencils. Her drawings had become treasured gifts throughout the neighborhood, with Mrs. Chun hanging Rosa's portrait of her fruit stand in the window of her grocery store. Big Tone approached with Detective Ortiz, both men now meeting weekly to discuss his community service progress. The transformation was remarkable. Antonio Ruiz had become the neighborhood's unofficial protector, but through service rather than intimidation. "How's our Team Rosa captain doing?" Detective Ortiz asked Luis with a genuine smile. "Rosa's getting stronger every day," Luis beamed, counting the morning's cookie sales. "And we raised enough for her next 3 treatments." As the afternoon sun painted golden streaks across the park, Stephen prepared to leave for his own apartment. Luis ran up to him, Rosa close behind despite her careful steps. "Mr. Seagal," Luis said earnestly. Thank you for showing us that being strong means protecting people, not scaring them. Stephen knelt to their level, his expression warm. You two taught me something important too. You showed me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right even when you are afraid. Rosa shyly handed him a drawing she'd made. Stephen, Luis, and Big Tone standing together under a rainbow, with Team Rosa written in careful block letters. This is perfect, Stephen said, accepting the artwork like the treasure it was. I'll keep this forever. As Stephen walked home through the transformed neighborhood, he could hear laughter and conversation echoing from the park behind him. A child's courage had sparked a community's renewal, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures create the most lasting change. In the distance, Luis's voice carried on the evening breeze. Fresh cookies, made with love for Rosa's recovery. Some stories, Stephen reflected, have the most beautiful endings of all. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.